reality is that the reason we're a segregated society is not because of private activity or self-choice or bigoted homeowners. The reason we're a segregated society is because of racially explicit, frequently written public policy by the federal, state, and local governments, all of it unconstitutional, all of it unlawful, designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another anywhere in this country. The policies that the federal government in particular, but state, local governments as well followed, were so powerful that they determined the racial segregation that we have still today and the racial inequality in so many other areas besides housing. It all comes to the segregation policies of the 20th century. I'll describe a couple of them if I have time. The most powerful one, perhaps, was a policy followed by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the immediate post-World War II period. Both of those agencies had a program to move the entire white working class and lower middle class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs from which African Americans were excluded. This was a racially explicit federal policy. At the time, we were a manufacturing economy, not like today. Then we were making things. That was the primary source of employment. And factories needed to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts or ship their final products. And the banks and the insurance companies that service those factories also needed to be located in those same downtown areas. And the people working in those factories and the banks and the insurance companies, many of them didn't have automobiles. They had to walk to work. They maybe take short streetcar rides. They all lived as well in those downtown areas. I'm not suggesting to you that every other house was of a different race, but the areas were broadly integrated. We had both blacks and whites living in much closer proximity in the mid-20th century or early 20th century than we have today. The federal government, as I said, embarked on a program to move the whites only out of those urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. The most famous of those developments, and this is the one I used in the Color of Law as an example, but they exist everywhere in the country, in the Boston area, Midwest, Southeast. The most famous of them is Levittown, east of New York City. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. 17,000 homes in one place in a rural area east of New York City. The builder, William Levitt, could never assemble the capital to build that project on his own. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money for such an enormous project and a speculative idea that people were going to want to live outside the city. It was a new idea. The only way that Levitt, and this is true of developers all over the country, in every metropolitan area, the only way that they could build these suburbs was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations after World War II, submit their plans for the development, the architectural design of the homes, the layout of the streets, every detail, the materials they were going to use, and an explicit commitment required by the federal government never to sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required that the builders, Levitt, for example, place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federal government requirement. The Federal Housing Administration had a manual, a written manual. This wasn't the action just of rogue bureaucrats acting out their own bigoted ideas. The Federal Housing Administration had a written manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders for federal bank guarantees for their projects. The manual said explicitly you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a developer who is going to sell homes to black people in their white developments. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the federal policy manual, that would run the risk run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial elements. Again, written federal policy, the notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. And there were many other policies at the federal, state, and local level. When you add them all up, you can see why we have a segregated society today.